Some of the most rewarding experiences of my life have been the discoveries of new music. They have been adventures of the mind. They began when, as a 15-year-old, I sat in the auditorium of the Odeon Theatre, Southend-on-Sea, and enjoyed the rejuvenated orchestra of Count Basie. I came out from that concert with my legs feeling like jelly. Recently, I discovered a new concerto on YouTube. And as I researched the story attached to this wonderful concerto, I discovered a most mind-bending and spine-tingling story. This is Steve Petchy of rebelslay.org, and I introduce to you the Lost Concerto. Picture this scene. It is spring 1933. The location, the Green Room, library of a grand and beautiful house, 10 Netherton Grove, Chelsea. It is the home of a renowned and very popular musical duo, the Durrani sisters, Adela and Jelly. Jelly and her friend Anna Robertson sit opposite at a table on which there are placed in a circle letter cards, and in the centre an upturned drinking glass. Both place their forefinger on the upturned glass and wait. The sisters, living in London since 1909, are Hungarian-born. Adela, now 47, and who in 1915 married the London barrister Alexander Fakiri, and Jelly, aged 39 and single. Both were nieces of one of the 19th century's greatest violinists, Joseph Joachim. The glass game, as it was referred to, had become a popular pastime in London as the nation slowly arose from the Great Depression. Neither of the sisters had ever been interested in spiritualist seances. In fact, in Hungary, any such activity only interested cranks. However, back in February or March, Jelly was staying with friends at Eastbourne after a concert, and in the evening she joined in their game. Her hosts asked questions, which Jelly thought silly, about the rise and fall of stocks. But suddenly the glass spelt out, "Adela is playing beautifully at the moment," which Jelly thought even sillier because she had left her sister in London for an afternoon concert, and she never made mistakes about what people she loved were doing. When, however, she telephoned to ask Adela how the concert had gone, she was staggered to hear that it had after all taken place in the evening, at the time this message came through the silly questions. Now some months later, both Jelly and her friend Anna had recently experienced an emotional ending of a relationship, and remembering her experience in Eastbourne, Jelly suggested they played the game, she hoping to receive some guidance or comfort from her departed mother. As they waited for some movement of the glass, there was none. But then they realized they had left out of the circle 3 letters, which they corrected. With a set of letters now complete, the glass first moved 3 times in a slow circle, before darting from letter to letter. It spelt out sentiments like, "We are glad you are here," not at all in the style of Madame Durrani. "Do I know you?" Jelly asked aloud, feeling a fool when there was nobody to know. The reply was that this person messaging had left Earth before Jelly was born and wanted her to find and play a posthumous work for the violin. This was the year of Brahms' centenary. Jelly had recently played the double concerto for violin and cello with Gaspar Casado and the Royal Philharmonic, and if any dead composer had been in her mind, it would have been Brahms. But when she asked if she might know who was speaking, and the letters got as far as Roberts, she thought that either Anna was playing a trick or her subconscious mind was doing so. Instead, the glass finished Chumann. Is it the Fantasia? She asked. She had more than once played this work, which was dedicated to Joachim. But no, it was something never published, a violin concerto. It is in Germany, in a museum, we think. Is it good? Asked Shelley, being the first thing that came into her head. The reply was that it was not one of my best works, but much better than a good deal that is being written today. Anna Robertson, who didn't much like this sort of pastime, refused to play any more. But Jelly told Adela of the experience, and the adventure to find out more about this work, the existence of which she had never heard, began. Before continuing with this intriguing story, may I take you back to the previous century and introduce the four musical greats who were the cause of this mystery: Robert and Clara Schumann, Johannes Brahms, and Joseph Joachim. Robert, born in 1810 of a comfortable middle-class family, was studying law in Leipzig when in October 1828 he heard performing a young protégé pianist, 9-year-old Clara Wieck. Schumann admired Clara's playing so much he asked permission from his mother to stop studying law, which had never interested him much, and take music lessons with Clara's father. As time drew by, they fell in love, and when Clara was 18, Robert proposed to her. However, her father, who had taught and planned his daughter's career as a pianist, would not consent to the marriage. After 4 years of legal strife, as Clara became of age, a judge overruled the father, and on 12th September 1840 they were married at the Lutheran Church in Schönfeld, now part of Leipzig, Germany. At the time of their marriage, Clara, who was the more famous, now sacrificed much of her career to giving birth and raising 8 children. For Robert, though, the first year of their marriage produced a prolific outpouring, composing 138 songs, some being the greatest of the 19th century. Also, Clara encouraged Robert to further his output of orchestral music, which included 4 symphonies and a piano concerto written for her. But the cloud that hung over their life together was Robert's mental health. Suffering from severe attacks, particularly after stressful tours, they came to a head in 1854, when he tried to commit suicide by throwing himself in the Rhine. Fishermen rescued him, but he then voluntarily entered a private sanatorium, where he died in 1856. But 2 important friends, almost coincidentally, entered their lives before those tragic events. 22-year-old Joseph Joachim, a Hungarian violinist and protégé of Felix Mendelssohn, burst onto the music scene in London when, as a 13-year-old, he played the solo part of Beethoven's violin concerto, which so far no one else had mastered. In 1853, Robert Schumann invited him to perform at the Lower Rhine Music Festival, which consolidated his reputation as the most renowned artist in Germany. At this time, Joachim heard the then unknown Johannes Brahms and was so impressed with his piano playing, he introduced him to the Schumanns. From that time on, Brahms and he became close friends, providing support to Clara during Robert's illness and after his death. The three of them also collaborated musically, Clara and Joseph performing recitals together, and Brahms dedicating his violin concerto to Joseph. With these introductions, I return to the intriguing story regarding the discovery, publishing, and performing of Robert Schumann's violin concerto, his last major composition. I quote extensively from the Sisters d'Aragny by Joseph MacLeod. Jelly's first port of call in her hunt for the concerto was H.C. Coles, the Times music critic. From off the shelves in his study, he took down one of the dark blue volumes of Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians, the third edition, which he had himself supervised in 1928. After studying an article, he said, "There is no such thing." Other musical authorities she asked also drew a blank. Turning to family sources, she asked her cousin Elizabeth, a granddaughter of Uncle Joe, who also said she knew nothing about such a thing. Jelly then resorted again to the glass, which said, "Robert Schumann, remember what I told you, Museum Weimar." She decided to try musicologist, musician and composer Donald Tovey, who had met Joachim in his childhood. Tovey was more informative. He recalled some manuscripts shown him by Schumann's daughter Eugenie when at Interlaken, which she was about to present to the Schumann Museum at Zwickau. But no violin concerto. With regards to the messages, he called himself a scornful skeptic. But with his intimate knowledge of Joachim, he knew that Schumann had written a violin concerto in 1853, which he thought was in D minor, though he did not know what had become of the manuscript. It was generally thought, among those who did remember it, that Joachim, Clara Schumann and Brahms, after long study, discussion, and a private run-through by Joachim in 1867, had sadly decided that it showed signs of Schumann's imminent mental breakdown, and that Joachim, after the deaths of Clara Schumann in 1896 and of Brahms in 1897, had deposited it somewhere with a proviso that it was not to be published or performed within 100 years of Schumann's death in 1856. But nobody knew where the manuscript lay. Next on the scene comes one Baron Erik Palmstierna, a Swedish minister in London who was a close friend of Adela and her husband, who was mildly interested in psychic matters, but had never been to a séance. Neither had Adela, but she became less sceptical when a friend discovered, by these means, where to find the drowned body of her mother. He and she agreed to follow up the Schumann matter, and so it was in July that same year, the glass intimated that Joachim was in touch, and when asked if he could locate the manuscript, he replied that it ought to be in the museum of the Berlin Royal High School of Music, but he couldn't remember for certain. In reply to the question, why had Schumann said Weimar? The answer was, he showed it to me there, but we do not know everything. So Jelly wrote to the director of this museum, but got no reply, for he was away. In August, Jelly and the Fakiris went for their usual summer holiday to Scotland, and Baron Palmstierna went back to Sweden for his. However, he returned by train via Berlin, where he had some hours to wait for a connection. It occurred to him to go to the high school and look for himself. The director was still away, ill, and a young secretary produced what there was in the library. They came upon a folder marked with Schumann's name, but it contained only odds and ends of music by other composers. A bystander advised the Baron to try the Prussian State Library. Here too, the director, Herr Wolf, was away on holiday. However, with the help of his assistant, he was eventually shown the manuscript of a violin concerto by Schumann in piano score, but not in his hand, and it was marked unfinished. On September 14th, he telegraphed the Aranyis that he had found the concerto. It was the wrong manuscript, but he was getting close to finding it. Finally, when Professor Schumann later succeeded to the directorship of the library, there were discovered 4 relevant manuscripts. 1, a version by a copyist with headings and corrections by Schumann. 2, the piano score just mentioned. 3, the violin part. And 4, a complete orchestral score with a piano part written in on the lowest staves. These piano staves were not included in the published version. Finding these manuscripts was one thing. Getting permission for copies to be made and for the work to be performed was quite another, which took several years. The Guardians absolutely refused public access of any kind till the ban should lapse in 1956. Back in England, messages via the glass kept urging patience, determination, and careful handling. When Willy Strecker, head of the music publishers Schropp and Son, came over to London for Jelly's performance of a Mozart concerto, she told him about the Schumann concerto and what they were trying to do. At first, he too was skeptical, but in the end, he undertook to do what he could in Germany. The glass was pleased at this, saying Strecker had the key, so they should leave it to him and meantime have patience. Strecker applied to Professor Altmann at the Prussian State Library, but the authorities were adamant nothing could be done. The glass suggested getting in touch with Elizabeth Joachim and through her with Johannes, Uncle Joe's eldest son who lived in Göttingen. This endeavour resulted in him giving Jelly permission to have a copy made, provided she kept it to herself and never played it in public. But even this was refused by the authorities. The conditions on which the manuscript had become state property could not be altered, even at the request of the son of the man who had laid them down. Then, to make matters more difficult, Schumann's surviving daughter, Eugenie, when she was 86, issued 2 printed pages in which she described an impressive scene at Frankfurt, when her mother Clara came into the room and announced that she, Joachim and Brahms had taken the decision against making the concerto public, neither now nor ever. Clara solemnly laid the manuscript in Joachim's hands on this understanding. This concerto must never be made public. However, Jelly did not give up. Mrs. Reginald McKenna, wife of the banker politician and friend of Jelly, was in Berlin at the beginning of November 1934 on a visit to our embassy. Palmstiana suggested that she examine the actual wording of the embargo in case there might be some legal loophole. She saw Dr. Cross, the general director of the library, but he could do nothing about the ban. When she pressed for photostats to be made for Jelly, Dr. Cross said that many manuscripts were entrusted to the library under conditions, and to make one exception would be to cause complications later. Also, once a copy had gone out of his hands, He could never be sure it would not be played or made other use of, and from this he refused to budge. But although Jelly was thwarted, German musicologists, now that attention had been drawn to the manuscript, appeared to have all the scholarly access they wanted. For in December 1935, Hermann Springer published in a French music periodical an article regarding the concerto, accompanied by a facsimile of the manuscript's first page. So at least the fruits of Jelly's perseverance ripened for musicologists and violinists the world over. The glass, however, renewed its pleas for action. In November 1936, it begged Jelly to take the matter very seriously. Sie müssen das Concerto erhalten. You must receive the concerto. And remember Schumann. So then, providentially, Professor Altmann died, and Willy Strecker of Schott was informed that the official decision had been revoked. But the first performance of the work, which was to be published by Breitkopf and Hartel, would be given in a version revised by Hindemith and played by the leading German violinist George Kulenkampff. Further, that ghastly Nazi, as Jelly called him, wanted a 25-year world monopoly of the concerto. Shocked, Strecker telephoned to the Fakiri house as soon as he arrived in London. Jelly was ill in bed, and the dealer came back from the telephone appalled. But, after all, the decision conformed to Nazi ideology. Schumann was a full-blooded Teuton, and Joachim a full-blooded Jew. It was consistent for Hitlerites to demand the world's first performance shall be given by an Aryan. But what struck Strecker to the heart was Breitkopf's announcement of their forthcoming publication. Had it not been for the efforts made in and from England, the manuscript would still be lying unused and forgotten. It was he who had been fighting for the release of the imprisoned concerto, and seeing that he and others had first been awakened and prodded to liberate it by Jelly d'Aragny, fairness itself, apart from her relation to Joachim, ought to award to her, of all top-line violinists, the honour and responsibility of its first interpretation. Although he did not prevail against the Nazi government regarding its performance, Strecker called a meeting of German officials and with vigour and determination argued them into granting publication to his firm. More time passed. The Germans announced and then postponed the date of the first performance in the Reichskulturkammer. However, Strecker had manoeuvred with skill. His right of publication covered disposal of performance outside Germany, and no more was said of a 25-year monopoly. At last, the arrangement seemed fixed as follows. Kulenkampff would play on October 19th, 1937, Jelly in London on the 20th in a BBC concert, and Yehudi Menuhin, to whom Strecker had sent a photostat copy and who was enthusiastic about the work, would give the first performance on the other side of the Atlantic later in the year. But the Germans cancelled this arrangement, and Kulenkampff's performance was postponed to November 13th. Menuhin had set his concert for the 3rd and had to put it off. But the BBC was in a more difficult position. Their planning of music programmes was months in advance, and alterations were fraught with woe. It was not feasible to find a new date so quickly. But the press had now got hold of the story, and even stating that Sir Adrian Boult, then the BBC Director of Music, and the Assistant Director Kenneth Wright had left for Berlin immediately. Although this was not the case, the matter had reached national diplomatic levels. Bolt advised Jelly to write to the Prime Minister. Now, Jelly was no fighter, nor did she like the publicity of self-importance, but she did have a natural possessiveness toward her protégé Concerto. So she wrote to Neville Chamberlain, who replied that the Foreign Office was taking up the case with Berlin, and he hoped all would go well, since he personally was looking forward to hearing her in this work. All did not go well. The Germans again altered the date, and October the 2nd, Strecker wrote to Bolt asking him to postpone Jelly's concert till February 16th following. Neither Jelly nor Bolt were inclined to the kind of publicity these postponements attracted, even for a world premiere of a never-heard classic. Though the BBC would have liked to give the first performance outside Germany, Bolt had, when fixing the original date of the concert, given Jelly full freedom to play it elsewhere first, if she so wished. But Jelly was neither equal nor willing to organise such a thing, and so they both agreed to the February date. Meanwhile, an excited and grateful Jelly was studying the score. She had been far from convinced of Hindemith's suitability as a reviser, but Tovey assured her that she would find he had done the job well. When her copy arrived in March, she did not like his alterations and was worried also about the proper interpretation of passages he had not touched. At Carnworth, Scotland in August, she, Adela, and Palmstierna asked the advice of the glass. According to its replies, Schumann did not like the new version either. It is not his technique. Also, the concerto was too full, and Hindemith had made it fuller. So there was little that needed doing to the original, and this little could be done by Jelly. It is important to know that when messages were received regarding technical details, Jelly herself did not touch the glass. That Palmstierna had never heard her practicing the work, and Adela only the first movement once. For a quite startling series of swift questions and answers followed, recorded in the séance transcripts on purely musical matters. Composition and technical details such as some passages could be played in a higher register, some of the accompaniment could be thinned out, and you can take out some of the notes if the harmony does not suffer. You can also use your judgment about bowing and often broaden the tone. Jelly asked about Hindemith's first alteration, which was a register higher. Answer: can you add a few notes, and can you play the demi-semiquavers very strongly and with a firm legato, firm bowing, not with the runs but the double stops. Do not play in a sharp tone, but very broad and smooth. This dialogue through the glass continued extensively, from the chords at the beginning to be played with the low notes separately and repeat the low note again, down to details like not on a thin kind of spiccato, but one from the wrist in regular horizontal movement, the bow a little sideways. Keep your outburst as a complete surprise. Your uncle knew that secret. Often there were initial confusions about which passages exactly were intended. Bar numbers meant nothing. Jelly was not at all at ease about her ability to do the editing, but she did use her judgment, and the musician in her did not let her down. When she was ready, she went off to Hinman Lodge, Tovey's Queen Anne house in Suffolk, where they played together, he from the piano score and she from memory of her own violin version. When they had finished, Tovey spun his piano stool round 3 times, crying, "You see what a good job Hindemith has made of it? You can trust every note of Hindemith." Actually, it was Jelly who had changed about 200 bars in the whole work, and these only in the violin part. But Tovey's approval of her work pleased her so much that she wrote to Anna Robertson. I am terribly happy and in love with both life and death. Time now drew near for Jelly to perform the work, and the news of the spirit messages broke vulgarly on an incredulous public. It broke first in the BBC News Bulletin on September the 23rd, 1937. Of course, reactions differed. There were convinced believers in a spirit world who triumphed, and there were skeptics who scoffed at spooks. There were also protests against resuscitating before its time a work which was sure to prove dull. There were also cranks. In response, Tovey wrote to the Times a long letter which he thought them generous to print in full, defending the disinterment of the concerto now rather than in 1956, when it would be merely a centenary affair with no effect as reparation of an injustice to Schumann's memory. In his letter, he accepted neither a spiritualistic nor a mechanical source of the messages, but suggested other rational explanations. With these ideas by one who had called himself a scornful skeptic, many open-minded people would agree with him. But the jocular side of the popular press did not, which distressed Jelly. But as Ernest Newman wrote to her, "You need not mind if jokers indulge in a little mild humour about the subject. It's a small world. Not everyone sees anything from the same point of view as anyone else." Adela, meanwhile, was content with a purely spiritual explanation, so long as she was not thereby committed to mediums and ectoplasm. Jelly knew only that what had happened to her had happened. She saw no reason to suppose that the thoughts or spirit of Robert Schumann had not somehow got in touch with her thoughts or spirit, which gave her a quiet, warm, pleased sense of belonging to founts of music bigger than herself. Well, apart from all the family and media squabbling, what people really wanted to hear, and what was more important than how it came to light, was the concerto itself. And so came the day of performance, February the 16th, 1938, in the Queen's Hall, with Sir Adrian Boult conducting the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Almost all musical Britain was either there or listening in. For her performance, Jelly shone out from the black and white orchestra in a white and silver lame dress by Molyneux. As she waited for the opening orchestral section to give her first entry, her habitual expression of contemplative expectation seemed deeper than ever. It was perhaps to her the greatest moment of her musical life so far, a life already rich in great moments. Her friends said she looked initiate. She may have looked so, but for some minutes she felt nothing but the fact that she had not put on the dress before getting ready for the concert, and the shoulder puffs rustled with every movement of her bow arm. Whether the concert had been taken as good, bad or indifferent, she received an ovation, and there was an enormous party at the Fakiris after, with, as one delighted guest wrote, a homemade supper far surpassing the usual ones supplied by caterers or parties. The 12-year-old daughter of the house helped to see that all guests had everything, and the figure in white and silver moved among them radiant and triumphant. After the concert, there was a plethora of letters and telegrams for Jelly. One of the most affecting came from Alfred and Herbert, Schumann's grandson and great-grandson, written in English from Berlin, who extended, I quote, "Our best thanks, dear Mr. Arani, to your violin for singing Robert Schumann's soul."